Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for October 6th, 2022. I'm going to give you a picture today of something which is quite extraordinary, which is the visible signs of the establishment going into a panicked state. This is happening around two issues at least. The first is the Ukraine war, and the second is the breakdown of the financial system. Now, on the Ukraine war, we're going to have the Schiller Institute will be holding a press availability today at 10 a.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central European time, which will be exposing the weak flank of NATO's Ukrainian war gambit. The main point is that the lies behind this are being exposed. The lie that somehow this is to defend sovereignty and democracy against the barbaric Russians. That's been a fraudulent narrative from the beginning, part of a hybrid warfare operation. As an example, the exposure of lies, the argument that Russia blew up their own Nord Stream pipeline. There's very few people who believe that, although NATO is continuing to imply that that's the reason it happened. Another lie, which is being used to sustain the idea of continuing the war, is that Ukraine will ultimately win, that the Western unity for the war to weaken Russia will maintain a firm commitment. Well, in fact, it's weakening, it's breaking apart. We see it in elections. We see it in protests in the street, as thousands have grown to tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands, out in the streets protesting the European government's commitment to this war. And we see it directly related to a rejection of the austerity policies being imposed because of the self-inflicted wounds of European governments in supporting the U.S. UK NATO war. Now, the other aspect that's part of the press conference today is the funding by NATO, especially the US and the British, in developing a hit list to silence opposition to this continuing war. The opposition to the war hawk policy is coming from honest reaction of the population that doesn't like the direction the world is heading. Now, the hit list took a hit, you might say, with an article in the New York Times yesterday, and we still need a fuller evaluation of this. But according to the New York Times, the US government was not happy that the Ukrainian government was involved in the hit against Daria Dugina, who was killed in a car bombing. She was on the Mirotvorets hit list. And the story is that the U.S. reprimanded the Ukrainians about this. Well, does that have something to do with the fact that we've been exposing NATO's involvement in coordinating the targeting? Well, we'll see. But you should join us today for the press availability. If you can't make it live, it will be archived. Now, the second area of panic is the global financial collapse. This has been coming for a while, but it's now in the headlines. Now, a change in policy is not expected. In fact, there's a continued determined push to go ahead for a global banker's dictatorship, sometimes called the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, but not to change the policy. Of course, the Schiller Institute and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have called for a move to a new financial architecture and a new strategic architecture. But those orchestrating the crisis will have neither of those. They intend to go to the very end to protect their collapsing system. Now, is it collapsing? Well, of course it is. We've been reporting this for a long time. In fact, it's been in a direction of collapse for 5 decades. But there was a report in Le Monde yesterday on the European Systemic Risk Board of the European Central Bank issuing for the first time a, quote, general warning, unquote, of systemic risk. Now, this was highlighted by the capital outflows and the rush to the dollar, which is underway now with the raising of interest rates in the U.S. especially. But there are three areas of concern identified in this report. One, the rise of U.S. interest rates during an economic slowdown affects the ability of households and businesses to meet their debt obligations. If it costs more to borrow and they're not making enough money to pay off their debt, then you're setting up the stage for a major wave of defaults. Secondly, the fall of financial asset prices. For example, the Standard & Poor's 500 index is down 23%. This further damages consumer spending and household finances. The third area identified by this European Systemic Risk Board is of the risk to the European banks if there is a wave of defaults of their clients, that the banks are not strong enough to survive that. Now, the long-time warning of the weakness in the system by LaRouche was about derivatives, which LaRouche once called assets of mass destruction. Well, Le Monde quoted the advisor to the European Systemic Risk Board who warned of, quote, weaknesses in unexpected places, unquote. He said, quote, I am concerned about the exposure of the markets to derivatives, unquote. Well, derivatives exist in the volume or the range of somewhere around $2 quadrillion worth of valuations. How can that be protected with a falling GDP, with merely pumping new financial aggregates in to back up these, or monetary aggregates to back up these financial aggregates? That's what LaRouche warned with the triple curve function, that it can't work without completely depressing the productive sector. Now, other warnings are coming from people such as former British Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, who said, quote, I would be worried about shadow banking, the non-bank financial sectors, unquote. These are unregulated and face a danger of a wave of defaults. Then you have The Economist, the magazine which was once the flagship publication of the Rothschild banking interests, and it represents the inside view of the City of London. Their October 4th issue is headlined, quote, groaning, financial markets are in trouble, where will cracks appear, unquote. They write that there is a, quote, sense of foreboding. The world is entering a new phase, unquote, characterized by troubles in financial markets which could produce, quote, catastrophic pain when financial institutions fail, unquote. That's from The Economist, warning of catastrophic pain. Now, they're caught in a dilemma that was identified years ago by LaRouche. You cannot use quantitative easing to bail out the financial system while you're raising interest rates, because it makes the amount of debt that's being accumulated more expensive to retire. Because as you borrow with higher interest rates to pay down today's obligations, you're increasing the total obligations. Well, how can you do that when you're arguing that you're going to fight inflation with it? So the idea of fighting inflation with at the same time of doing quantitative easing will not work. But instead of putting their bankrupt oligarchical system into orderly bankruptcy reorganization, they're rushing full speed ahead with war spending and war. For example, the expansion of global NATO, with democratic, in quotes, dictatorships, the Great Reset, and the argument that you have to sacrifice for the glory of Ukraine. And also mass starvation, which is a policy designed to reduce the world's population, which is one of the longtime goals of the grouping that controls the financial institutions, the corporate cartels, the City of London, the House of Lords, people like King Charles, who argue that population reduction is the most important way to fight so-called man-made global warming. Now, if that were your plan, to ask people to sacrifice in order to bail out a bunch of bankrupt swindlers, Would you want open and free discussion about it? Well, that's the reason they're going for censorship. Of course you don't want that. If you're against NATO arming Ukraine, you're called an information terrorist, which is a label that was stuck on me by these hit lists. If you say the West's economic problems are the result of 50 years of neoliberal policies made worse by sanctions and war, you're called a Putin mouthpiece. Well, Helga Zepp-LaRouche had the perfect response to this. She said, we didn't need Putin to tell us this. LaRouche has a 50-year record of forecasting where he's identified the problem of moving from a productive physical economy to a speculative system that's propped up by funny money from the central banks. I began writing and speaking about this in the early 1980s when Putin was still a junior intelligence operative stationed in Dresden. So the idea that we're somehow agents of Russian propaganda because we actually understand physical economics is another one of these frauds that's being exposed the more discussion occurs in the public arena about real economics. So the establishment is in a panic. They can't hide their incompetence or their evil. Now, to get a more full update on this, go to the Schiller Institute website at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Central Time, to get a full report on how NATO is using Ukraine's secret services to publish hit lists, paid for by U.S. taxpayers and tax dollars, to silence opposition to these policies. And I'll be back tomorrow for Friday questions. Send them to me if you have some questions at harleysch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining me today, and make sure you get on this event today to get the full details of how the financial establishment and the oligarchical establishment is going through conniptions to try to keep the truth from getting out to you.